Good evening and welcome to the Kansas Legislature, our Friday evening call-in talk show dealing with politics and proceedings of the Kansas Legislature in Topeka. I'm Jay Steinmetz, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Fort Hays State University, and you are watching Smoky Hills Public Television. We have a great show lined up this evening and a couple of representatives of the Kansas House of Representatives. First, to my left, we have Representative Clarke Sanders of the 69th District of the Kansas House. That's the west half of Salina, Kansas. And across the table from me, we have Representative Rui Xu of the 25th District. That is the northwest portion of Johnson County here in Bunker Hill. Welcome, representatives, for another session. Thank you for joining us here. Let's get down to business and talk about agriculture and rural development right away. In terms of agriculture in statewide Kansas, and in particular western Kansas, what's the biggest problem that we're facing with regards to Kansas agriculture? What issue would you identify specifically as an issue or a problem that is an area of improvement with regards to the ag sector? And what solutions do we have to solve this problem? Let's start with Representative Clarke Sanders.
Well, the kids aren't staying on the farm. I mean, it's a totally different model than it was back in days gone by. A lot of times you'll see that kids will grow up and they'll go off to college and they'll never come back. They may never come back to Kansas, but they certainly don't come back to the farm. And so as a result of this, farms are getting bigger and bigger. Now, I think a solution of this probably lies in technology. There is a lot of technology that's on the way. It would have been absolutely inconceivable to a farmer 50 years ago that he wouldn't have to have a tractor. Everything on the farm revolved around the tractor, right? But not only now do we have tractors today that can be driven, they're driverless. GPS can drive them. We're getting to the point where we're going to have driverless or tractorless implements where there will be no need for a tractor to be pulling an implement because it'll be able to go on its own. And as a result of that, it can operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week if it wants, and so we'll be able to get a lot more done in a shorter period of time. But at the moment, we're not there yet. And so at the moment, the fact that kids are leaving the farm.
Yeah. Representative Xu, you come from a district not heavily agriculture, but you have a vested interest in this, and you've talked a lot about this in Topeka. What are some of the biggest problems you see, and what are some solutions that you might have for agriculture in Kansas?
Sure. I totally agree with Representative here about keeping the kids in rural areas. That is absolutely a problem. Outmigration is a huge issue in Kansas. Outside of that, I think there's a really interesting tension that we'll see over the next 20, 50 years between agriculture, the industry, and the environment, water quality, water quantity, soil quality, and what we can do to balance all those interests, because obviously it's a huge driver of the economy of the state, but all of that has the assumption of a healthy earth, and we have to be good stewards of the earth to keep this economy going.
Yeah, it seems like there's maybe too much of a dichotomy between ag interests and environmental or climate interests, but you seem to suggest that there shouldn't be a dichotomy, that these can be mutually positively reinforcing policy issues.
Yeah, sure, and water quality is a big issue. I've had a lot of conversations actually about soil quality as well, implementing policies that are help sequester carbon in the soil. A lot of very conservative farmers that I've talked to have already started doing that. This is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democratic issue. It's just about being good stewards of the earth. And a lot of our farmers are doing a good job of that, but we can do even more.
Thoughts about that, Representative Sanders? You know, climate issues, conservation, and ag issues. How do we bring those together to possibly reinforce those policy areas?
Well, definitely being good stewards of the earth is something that is absolutely at the top of the list. Now, how that falls under quote-unquote climate issues, I don't know. But, I mean, it is definitely in the farmer's self-interest to have good soil in which to farm. So, I mean, I think our farmers are good stewards of the earth.
Paint me a picture here. What's the ideal development of Kansas agriculture? if we can achieve the very best that's possible in terms of ag policy, and this question for Representative Xu first, what does our state look like in terms of ag policy 20 years from now, 50 years from now?
For me, it's a policy that precisely does what we just talked about. It balances the earth, the climate, and the economics of the state. And to a further extent, keeps our kids here. We need to do a better job of keeping our college graduates here in Kansas, on the farm maybe, but in general, just keeping a thriving rural sector of the state.
Representative Sanders, you painted an interesting picture there with driverless tractors, tractorless implements. Other things to add about what does it look like in 20, 50 years?
Well, I mean, who knows? But
in the ideal scenario.
Yeah, well, in the ideal scenario, everybody who wants to be on the farm can be on the farm. In the ideal scenario, practices have improved to the point that we're able to feed the nation with less land, because, I mean, the fact of the matter is, as Will Rogers said, buy land, they ain't making any more of it. Well, when land goes out of ag production, where is that going to be made up? So we've got to be able to have higher yields on the land that we have.
Mm-hmm. Let's slide into rural development here, but it just briefly, Representative Xu, you're coming from a more suburban, more urban district. Why should your more urban and more suburban constituents, why should they care about agriculture out here in western Kansas?
Where does food come from? Where does the food that all of us eat come from? It comes from rural agricultural Kansas. And furthermore, I grew up in rural Missouri. I grew up in Rolla, Missouri, and it is intensely important just for the culture. You get a very different feel of the world in rural Kansas than you do in urban Kansas, and that should be preserved. That should be appreciated as well. I also think there's an interesting conversation to have. A lot of the conversations we have about rural Kansas is very nostalgic and for a good reason, but I think there are interesting conversations to be had about, again, what does a rural thriving community in 20 years maybe look like? With the pandemic, we've seen a lot of people kind of move home maybe to their parents to help watch the kids, and they love it. And so with the future of remote work and portability of jobs, I think it's a really exciting time to think about what it can do for rural Kansas.
Just a reminder here, this is a call-in show. We appreciate all of your calls out there with regards to politics, what's happening in the legislature right now. Our number for the call-in show is 1-800-337-4788. That number is 1-800-337-4788. We look forward to your calls. Rural development, aside from just agriculture, how do we have thriving rural communities out here in western Kansas? How do we get to a place where, as Representative Xu had said, the pandemic has brought us a reality that maybe a lot of our work can be done at home. What are things that the Kansas Legislature could do specifically that might help and aid that rural development more broadly? Representative Sanders?
Well, I wish I had an answer to that, and I don't, frankly, because if you look at the population trends, the only area of our state that's growing is the area of the state that Representative Xu represents. Everywhere, even in Salina, we're, from what I've heard, going to lose a little bit of population when the 2020 census comes out. And there are huge percentage-wise losses in population west of Salina. I mean, every county in western Kansas is losing population. I wish I had an answer, but frankly, I don't.
Yeah, it's the largest demographic decline in American history. Some of these Kansas counties out here in western Kansas, over a 100-year period of time, 70%, 80% population losses. That's huge. Obviously not sustainable.
My wife grew up on a farm in the 50s and 60s, and her father supported a family of 6, him, his wife, and his 4 daughters, on a quarter of a section. A quarter of a section. That is unheard of today. Nobody could possibly do that.
How do we level off some of these population declines? How do we attract folks out here? Is it jobs? And this is something that we've discussed a lot on this show with rural development. What comes first, housing or jobs? There's also a housing crunch out here. There are a lot of folks who affordable housing is a real challenge. Is it the answer affordable housing? Or is it jobs? Which comes first, the cart or the horse? And how do we facilitate that obviously from a legislative perspective, there's only so much that state government can do to fuel private initiative. But are there things in the legislature, Representative Xu, that we can do to help advance rural development?
Yeah, I think housing is absolutely an issue. We've heard from the rural areas especially, builders just don't really have an incentive to build houses. They're not going to make their money back on building houses up there. And so that is something that I know is being examined and that we're going to continue looking at. I would be supportive of an interim committee or kind of a standing joint committee to look specifically just at housing in the state. Because not only is it an issue in rural areas, it's also an issue in my area where, you know, the neighborhoods are fairly mature, but a lot of people are moving in, and we're going to need more high-density housing, which, as you can imagine, leads to some interesting city council meetings.
Representative Sanders, any thoughts?
I grew up in the Chicago suburbs, and I go home once in a while to Arlington Heights, Illinois, where I grew up, and it's amazing the number of teardowns. And what I mean by that is houses that were perfectly good houses have been torn down so these mini mansions can be built in their place. And I don't think you're ever going to see anything like that in western Kansas. I could be wrong, but I don't see it.
To work from home, which we talked about with regards to the pandemic, requires, obviously, broadband and affordable internet access. To what extent, and I've asked this question on the show before, to what extent should we be thinking about high-speed fiber optic cable broadband as a right, as an essential utility for economic activity? Representative Xu, thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree with that. I think especially with the pandemic and schooling especially, you've seen having high-speed internet is an essential part of being in a modern economy. And I've said this many times on many shows, but I'm tired of Kansas being 47th in the country to do something, 48th in the country to do something. We want to be part of the game. We want to be leaders in the game. And then having high-speed internet is absolutely part of that, not only for schools, but also just in terms of internet jobs and, again, portability of jobs, working remotely. You know, if people want to work in rural Kansas with their parents and help watch the kids, but still be able to do their city jobs, that needs to happen.
Representative Sanders?
I'm not going to go as far as to say that high-speed internet is a right. I don't believe that. But we can create tax policy, the people who are going to develop it. There's got to be a capitalistic interest in developing high-speed internet in the state of Kansas. We need it. I mean, I definitely agree with that. And when the need reaches a critical mass, I think the free market will take care of it.
Let's switch topics here. Talk about Department of Labor issues, unemployment issues. You're getting a lot of constituent mail, a lot of concerns about this. Thoughts on this? Where are the constituents right now in terms of this issue, and what can the legislature do to solve some of these problems?
Well, to quote the movie Network, they're mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore. People aren't getting their money. I mean, people are not getting their money, and it's a mess. And the problem, I mean, there's a myriad of problems. One of the problems is there's been a lot of fraud, and there have been millions and millions of dollars paid out fraudulently to people who don't deserve it. And that means that people who do deserve it aren't getting it. It means that they've tightened up the process for getting your money, and so people who have a legitimate right to the money can't get into their accounts. Now, the governor recently announced that she was adding, 450 new jobs to the call center to get in. But what I'm hearing from my constituents, I heard from a couple today. In fact, somebody called me on my cell phone earlier this afternoon. And the stories are eerily familiar, that they stopped getting their money in November. They stopped getting their money in December. They try to call. They can't get through. People talk about calling 1,500 times and not being able to get through. They're told by a recording to go online to the get benefits. I'm not sure what the website is, but they're told to a website, and they're locked out of their account. It's terrible. It's ridiculous, and it has been something that I've been dealing with since day one, and as a freshman, and literally since my first day in the legislature. And we've been given some instructions about what to do and what to tell our constituents, and we're doing that, but it's not, sometimes it results in them getting a call. In other words, somebody from Department of Labor calls out to them, but in a lot of cases, it doesn't result in them getting any money. And we've got to start getting the money into the hands of the people who deserve it, while at the same time keeping it out of the hands of the people who don't deserve it. It is clearly the biggest problem that I've had to deal with since I've been in the legislature.
Representative Xu, thoughts from your constituents as well? Is this the biggest problem that you've faced, and what kind of solutions do we have?
It's one of them, and it has genuinely been a really tough issue, and everybody who deserves these benefits needs to get paid. And I will say that over the last 2 or 3 weeks or so, I don't know if you're experiencing that, it's been a lot smoother. The volumes are a little bit down. More people are getting paid. But I will say that this is the end result of a really long time of not maintaining the system, and when you don't have the money to maintain a system, a lot of problems arise. We're still on a mainframe, and there are like 2 qualified programmers in the entire state who can actually deal with the program. So when one of the issues that happened was a lot of my constituents, they stopped getting paid December 26th. That's kind of the magic date. That is because Congress and the president had let the CARES Act expire, and then a couple weeks later it launched a new program. So that literally meant that, the 1 or 2 programmers in the state who were able to do this had to very quickly come up with entirely new code to put into the mainframe to make it happen. And if I've learned one thing from the mainframe in talking with my friends at the Department of Labor, is when you make one change one place, it's going to mess it up. And so ultimately, this is an issue of technology, of modernization, and this is what happens when you don't invest the money to modernize. And I will say that we have and are planning to put more money in it. I think by December 2022, we're going to completely modernize the system. But so much of the issues over the last year have been getting that mainframe stable. I don't think what people realize is that a lot of the programs that we've been using are out of date. They don't get updated. They're non-secure, because the technology has not been not secure, but just they're just not updated. And so we need to update the system in order to get faster payments, to be more agile with.
The governor has had over a year to fix this problem. It wasn't like this problem we didn't know. Now, I'll give her a little bit of grace in the sense that the system became overwhelmed back in February and March, but she's had a year to fix it. It's been an epic failure of the Kelly administration that we aren't further down the road.
Quick response on that?
I will say that it's actually been 5 different problems along the way. There was the volume issue in February and March, and then there was different coding issues, and then there was the cutoff in December, and then there was fraud. And so basically what we learn is when one issue gets fixed, right? If one issue gets modernized, then just one step down the line, that bottleneck gets there, and then that bottleneck gets there. And I guess my takeaway from this is just that, again, and this is true of roads, this is true of any critical infrastructure, is that the money has to be there to update, to maintain, or else when things really hit the fan, you get really tough issues like what we're seeing here.
We've got a caller on line 1, Tom from Hayes. Good evening, Tom. What is your question?
My question is, last year on unemployment benefits, I was around $12,000 for that year in total benefits. And what do I do and who do I call? They put me on a 1099 this year for $25,000.
Yeah, I would say, Tom, that you're from Hayes. Barb Wassinger is your local House representative. You got to reach out to your local representatives. They should be able to contact you right away. I know that Representative Wassinger is very conscientious about reaching out to anyone who calls her with those issues or problems.
Jay,
have you been hearing a lot from your constituents?
I think it would be fair to say we all are, Republican or Democrat. I mean, nobody, it doesn't matter what letter you have behind your name, wants to see people not getting what they have coming to them. Now, what is not helpful is when somebody emails all 165 of us, meaning 125 in the House and 40 in the Senate. Find out who your House representative is, and yeah, if you're from Hayes, it's probably Representative Wassinger. Find out who your state senator is, and
That'd be Senator Billinger.
yeah, Billinger, and contact those two offices. Just contact those offices. Contacting all of us doesn't put you any further down the road. But when my local constituents call my office, we get on it immediately. Now, that doesn't mean we get results immediately, but we get on it.
You know, it's a really great point. I think that the public has to be aware of who their representatives are, and so
Yes.
often they're not. And how do we reach the public about making sure that they're aware of who their representatives are at the state level and at the federal level as well, and having a relationship at least where the public is well aware of who to reach out to, because so often if they reach out to the right representatives, they're going to get some kind of response. Maybe not a solution, as you said, but at least a response.
So if you Google Kansas Legislature, the Kansas Legislature website comes up. On the left-hand side, find your legislature. I mean, even if you're not very computer savvy or internet savvy, it's not that difficult to do. And certainly you could call a local official in your community, somebody locally, and says, "Who's my representative?" And you can find out. And then again, on the Kansas Legislative website, you can find out not only his or her name, but you can find out his or her office number. And that's where you need to start.
Representative Xu, broader question too about how do we bring the public into at least greater awareness about state, local government, elected officials. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I put the onus on myself, but I think most representatives probably fall in the same trap as I do, is you kind of hear from the same 30 people a lot, but then a lot of people are kind of removed from the process or separate from the process. So one of my goals is to include those people. One of those things that I did when the pandemic first hit was I sent out a newsletter to almost everybody in my district, and just to say, hey, I know times are tough, I know times are going to be tough, here's my information, here's what I'm here to help out with. And I actually had quite a few calls, both immediately after I sent that newsletter and up till now, people who have saved my information on their fridge and who reach out as a result of that. So I think we all can do a better job of putting it on ourselves to let you know that we're here.
I would agree that it's not that difficult to do. If you're motivated to do it, and certainly people who are not getting their unemployment payments are motivated to do it, it can be done. It's not that hard. I mean, just look around your community at the yard signs that were out during the last campaign and figure out who got elected and contact that person. If you want to get it done, you can get it done. And we debated in the education committee about taking a civics test, and we passed that through. Now, it was way too watered down for my taste, but a question on a civics test is not only who is your United States representative, who are your United States senators, but who are your local representatives? Who represents you in the Kansas House? Who represents you in the Kansas Senate? These are people you need to know who they are. And again, not that hard to find out.
We've got another caller here. Beth, I believe, from Sedgwick on line 1. Good evening, Beth. What is your question?
Hello there, and thank you both for serving in the legislature. It's much appreciated. I just would like to have their feedback on the whole issue of taxes and yet all the services that Kansans want and desire, such as better roads and bridges, especially in our rural areas, the waiting list for disabled, care for our seniors so they can stay in their homes safely, the crisis in mental health, and yet there just seems to be this tension with cutting taxes. I'd be interested in their perspectives. Thank you.
Great question. I'm going to add a couple of data points from the Kansas Speak survey, which was published by the Docking Institute last fall on taxes. 50.1% of respondents prefer either higher taxes and spending or keeping the current level of taxes and spending. Only 24.4% for higher, the rest of that for keeping at the same rate. 49.8% prefer lower state taxes and spending. It seems to be a divided issue. There seems to be plenty of support. If you look down the line, are those in favor of higher taxes and spending, 69% favor increased spending on K through 12 education. Infrastructure is also very popular. But you seem to have a fairly divided issue with regards to taxes and spending. Folks want services. We need investment in public education. We need investment in infrastructure. We also have to balance that with some fiscal responsibility. Representative Xu, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's tough to balance that all the time. That is essentially the toughest part about the legislature, is balancing all of that. I think all of us have our issues that we think are important and should be funded more. But where does that come from? That comes from another representative's priorities as well. I will say for my personal philosophy is I believe, I think there gets to be the stereotype that Democrats want big government, Republicans want small government. And I want to start from a place of agreement. I think we only want government to be as big as it needs to be. I think the difference is that we might have different opinions on what needs to be. So for me, the big things are public education, and we need to make sure to fund that. I will also say that I pulled this question specifically in my own district. I have a very, very high income district. And what I found out was very interesting is that they would actually support an additional tax bracket. They actually asked for more taxes on themselves as a high income district, which I was not expecting when I asked that question. So my district, at least, and I'm not going to speak for anybody else's, would support at least another income bracket to help pay for some of these services, especially as we go into pandemic recovery.
Representative Sanders, thoughts?
I'm for lower taxes. It's difficult to achieve, but I'm for limiting exemptions. So, I mean, when you talk about, I don't know, is the caller still with us or not? Because I'd like her input in. So if we're going to raise your taxes to increase your services, then would you like to see your property taxes go up? Would you like to see sales tax go up? In Salina, it's 10% now between the state and local taxes, and in downtown Salina, it's even higher than that, because there's a special taxing district in downtown Salina. Would you like to see your income tax go up? And there are certainly solid arguments about not raising any of those taxes. My basic philosophy is that we've got to do more for ourselves. The things that we can do for ourselves, we need to do for ourselves.
It seems the highest percentage is in favor of lowering sales tax. And I know the sales tax in Kansas is rather regressive. It's a sales tax that includes food and clothing. A lot of other states exempt those kinds of items from a sales tax. Thoughts on that, Representative Xu? Do we have a sales tax that's too regressive, too high? How do we balance that out?
Yeah, it's very high. It's way too high. I think it's one of the, again, with property taxes, one of the least popular taxes. But right now, in a budget crunch, that conversation has not come up much about lowering the food sales tax. But this is, again, one of those issues where there is some bipartisan agreement on lowering it. But again, it has to come from somewhere. And so, again, the question that I asked my constituents is kind of framed at, would you agree to another income bracket if it came with a lowering of food sales tax? And they would very much agree with that. I for years have, not in the legislature, of course, because I just got there, but for years on the radio, I advocated for either eliminating or reducing the grocery sales tax. So a lobbyist was in talking to me about that the other day, and said, but we'll do it as an offset because we're going to raise the tax on cigarettes. Well, for folks in Reeves district, I don't know that's such a good idea. You can buy your smokes in Missouri and come back to Kansas. So it might have the effect of us getting less tax revenue,
for any of the border counties. Probably, if you raise it high enough, the folks in Wichita would go down to Oklahoma.
We've got another caller here, line one as well. Carson from Medicine Lodge. Good evening, Carson. What is your question?
Hello. Since her election, Governor Kelly has fallen short on a number of promises, such as repealing the grocery tax and really with her promises on infrastructure. So what can the legislature do to help and work with the governor on those issues?
Go with Representative Xu first. Promises, hard to keep in extraordinary times with COVID and everything else, but what are your responses? How do you work with Governor Kelly to hold her feet to the fire and try to push through some of these promises that have been made?
Sure. I will say that last year we passed a brand new 10-year transportation plan, infrastructure plan, so I don't know that I would agree with that one, but on the other stuff, like Medicaid expansion, you know, the governor has her duties, but ultimately it's up to the legislature to pass it. And while we did out of the House, it died out of the Senate last year. So, you know, it comes down to the makeup. We were hoping to get some more help for Medicaid expansion in 2020, and we didn't. And so ultimately, it comes down to the makeup of who gets elected.
Representative Sanders, thoughts?
So, the truth be known, the legislature, the Republican majority in the legislature, doesn't get along with the governor very well. And would you say that's a fair assessment?
I would say that's accurate.
Okay. So I don't know. And as we're getting, closer to an election season, it's going to become more and more difficult for a Republican majority to work with a Democrat governor. Now, in a perfect world, it shouldn't matter. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a political world, and it does matter. And she has fallen short in a number of areas. Now, what's interesting is we just this past week passed something called the Kansas Emergency Management Act, KEMA for short. They're big on acronyms up in Topeka. And it really severely limits the power of this governor or any governor going forward in a quote-unquote emergency situation. It passed 118-5 in the House. It passed big in the Senate too. It will limit her power, but it'll limit the governor's power. She happens to be the sitting governor. So it will reduce greatly the governor's power of what to do in an emergency, and it passed with veto-proof majorities in both houses. So it'll be interesting to see what she does with it.
You mentioned Medicaid expansion, Representative Xu. I want your thoughts on that.
We can't afford it. That's my thought. We cannot afford it. In a perfect world, we could. Right now, we can't.
Thoughts on that?
I would say we can't afford not to do it. We have 150,000 people at least who would be eligible for Medicaid expansion. And if you guys have been following the federal news, the Biden administration and then federal Congress has given us even more money, given us more incentive to pass Medicaid expansion. I think what's true in the legislature as appropriators is you appropriate what you deem valuable. And certainly I think the health of our most vulnerable Kansans is a very high priority for myself and I know the governor.
What would be the state's obligation in terms of Medicaid expansion? I believe it's around 90% federal. Do you have estimates as to how much money that state obligation would be?
The last that I saw, it was about $60 million the first year, and I don't remember past that. But again, the federal carrot is like $300, $400 million if the states pass it, which I think is significant. And again, the governor released a plan to tie medicinal marijuana and the tax revenue with that, with Medicaid expansion. So in terms of being able to afford it, that kind of reduces that concern, I think.
Let me ask you about the tie here in a second, but just very briefly, the states who have expanded Medicaid, and a lot of conservative Republican states who had a little bit late to the game but expanded it, we see that there is some good positive effects and outcomes. We also have in the COVID relief bill even more money, even greater incentivization. Does that change your viewpoint at all? Make it easier to at least consider, Representative Sanders?
Well, first of all, we haven't seen the budget numbers yet. And until we get the overall picture, no, it doesn't make it easier for me to consider it. Now, once we see the full budget, we'll see.
Linking to medical marijuana. With tax revenues from medical marijuana covering the state's cost obligation for Medicaid expansion. Thoughts on that?
I don't, again, I'm certainly aware of that situation, and I don't think that's a good idea. I think that medicinal marijuana is something that we should definitely consider, and frankly, I would be, I think, in favor of it. We'd have to hear it and see what opponents to that would have to say. But as I sit here this evening, I think I'm in favor of medicinal marijuana. I've heard of too many instances where it's helped people with little or no detrimental effects, but I don't think linking it to Medicare is a good idea.
Can I ask why a little bit, just in terms of detail? Is it
where's
those
the money?
revenues-
Where's the money going to come from?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is it going to get us there? And if so, how?
Mm-hmm. And maybe any potential tax revenues that come from medical marijuana, you would rather see go to in other directions or used for other things? Thoughts on that, Representative Xu?
Well, something that's interesting to me, that comparing, the Republican caucus versus the Democratic caucus, is we hear the governor is too political from the Republicans, but for me, sometimes she's frustratingly not political from my district. I think I would have gone even farther and tied it to recreational marijuana, which I also think is a popular issue. And so I think that the governor actually took a very moderate, smart approach with the medicinal marijuana. But yeah, I would absolutely support the Medicaid and medicinal marijuana plan, but I would support going even further.
Let's talk about recreational marijuana. The Kansas Speak survey published in the fall, I was very surprised by this statistic, 66.9% either strongly supported or somewhat supported legalizing recreational marijuana. That's 66.9% of Kansas respondents in the Kansas Speak survey. That's a higher percentage than support for expanding Medicaid at 63.5%. That's for legalizing recreational marijuana for individuals 21 and older and allowing taxation by the state. Only 22.2% somewhat or strongly opposed. Is it time to seriously consider this issue, Representative Sanders?
I think the first step in this issue would have to be, and I support this, is an elimination of the federal prohibition against recreational marijuana. There are all these states, I mean, you can quote them probably better than I can, California, Oregon, on and on. I don't know what the number is, that have quote unquote legalized marijuana. No, they haven't. Nobody, no state has legalized marijuana because there's still a federal prohibition in place. Now, there shouldn't be a federal prohibition in place. This should be a state issue. So I think the first thing that has to happen is you got to get rid of the federal law that outlaws marijuana in all recreational marijuana in all 50 states. The second thing I think you have to do is get medicinal marijuana legalized and see what, if any, problems come from that. And then following that, after a period of time, we could consider, and I wouldn't be opposed to considering recreational marijuana if those first two steps were taken.
The first step takes an act of Congress, Capitol Hill in Washington, to do that kind of...
But if there's such overwhelming support for it,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I don't think the Kansas numbers are out of step with the rest of the country, and clearly they're not out of step with the states that have already quote unquote legalized it. But I think that needs to happen first.
Yeah, I read a statistic that it's around 60% of Americans now live in an area where recreational marijuana is legal. You mentioned California and Oregon, yes, but we've got now South Dakota with legal recreational marijuana, a whole bunch of other states that aren't traditionally progressive
Sure.
or so. Can you talk a little bit about some of the detail, Representative Xu? How would recreational marijuana look? Is there a state that has modeled recreational marijuana in a way that is better than others? They've all done things differently with implementation of it. Any ideas or thoughts that you have how tax revenue is to be collected? Where does it go? Do you write it into the bill exactly where it goes? Thoughts on that?
So those are all policy questions and all valid. I will say that we did introduce a bill, a couple of the young legislators, it's HB 2430 if you're interested in reading it. It got introduced in Fed and State as the full recreational legalization bill, and it's heavily based on the Colorado model. Colorado is a neighbor. It seems to be successful. There might be differences and nuances. Colorado has a couple more. It's a more tourism state already outside of marijuana, and so that might lead to outside revenue otherwise, but I support it going just towards the state general fund and then appropriating towards other services, as we all kind of talked about before. But that's the model that we've looked at.
Yeah, in Colorado, actually, differently than two that I've looked at in detail, Oregon and Colorado. Oregon, it just goes to sort of general fund, and there's been some issues with that, whereas in Colorado, tax revenue went directly to specific policy areas, education first, infrastructure second. Is that a model that you would prefer in terms of policy, generally speaking?
I think back to 1988, and you weren't even around in 1988, but back in 1988, when the state legalized the lottery and legalized betting at the track, dog and horse racing and that sort of thing, the money from the gambling proceeds was not linked to education. A lot of people get confused about that, and they think that lottery ticket sales goes to education. Well, it doesn't. It goes to economic development, and a little bit of it goes to higher ed, but none of it goes through K through 12. Well, I think that was a big mistake, linking it to a specific area. I agree with Representative Xu that we ought to put it in the general fund and use it as needed rather than link it to a particular thing. I think we made a big mistake back in '88.
Okay. Gives the legislature more flexibility? Is
Sure.
that what you're saying?
I mean, who knows what the issue in tax committee recently, we were hearing from a guy who wants to build electric charging stations for electric automobiles, and they've got a grid set up, and they want to make it so no matter which direction you drive in the state of Kansas, you won't go further than 50 miles before you'll have the ability to charge up your vehicle. Now, you don't need to charge your vehicle every 50 miles because the range is something like 250 or 300 miles, but no matter where you are in the state of Kansas, you're no more than 50 miles away from charging an electric vehicle. That wasn't even an issue 10 years ago. Maybe it wasn't even an issue 5 years ago. It's an issue today. So it's impossible to say. I mean, the issues change as time goes on. And to tie any tax revenue that might come from recreational marijuana is a mistake, because what looks good today might not look good 10 years from now.
Quick thoughts and responses to that. The concern might be on the other side of the ledger, that with greater flexibility of the legislature, possibility of wasteful spending, work, special interest projects that really don't benefit. What are your thoughts about that? On a broader policy, how much flexibility should we give a legislature in terms of determining?
Sure. I mean, these are just kind of very direct policy questions that we get all the time. I could be convinced, to put it directly towards education. I could be convinced to put it directly towards infrastructure or mental health. Those are all valid things to fund. But for me, for my purposes, for now, I think state general fund makes sense. As this conversation moves forward, I believe the bill that we introduced is the first recreational legalization bill that's ever been introduced. And so it's the start of the conversation. And so as it moves down the line, as the years go on, I'm open to having those.
We've got another caller here. Randy from Great Bend is on line 1. Good evening, Randy. What is your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if the gentleman would consider that the federal overreach has finally reached its limit, and if they would consider any legislation that would stop overreach.
Randy, federal government overreach? think we lost the caller. But I believe Randy is talking about federal government overreach, what the federal government does. Obviously, issues of federalism means, purview of the states, purview of the federal government. Not much you can do from
No,
Topeka.
I mean, he needs to have that conversation with Tracy Mann or with Jerry Moran or Roger Marshall. That's not what we're dealing with.
Yeah, reach out to those U.S. representatives, the Kansas caucus, U.S. House Representative Tracy Mann in Washington, or Jerry Moran or Roger Marshall. Thoughts on just in general the question there, Representative Xu?
Yeah, I think this is always an interesting question about what the best level of government to do something is: local, state, federal. There are things that absolutely constitutional we have to do, are allowed to do. And I think there are valid conversations to be had. Generally, I think everybody agrees that local is the best way to go, what's close to the people. But other than that, that question was vague.
We've got another caller here, line 1, Bob from Salina. Good evening, Bob. What is your question? Oh, we lost that caller. I wanted to mention, just wheel back a little bit to some of the economic issues. When we talked about unemployment and the Department of Labor, we have a crisis with regards to the unemployment funds. But we also have just a genuine crisis of a lot of people out of work, and the economy is suffering. And one area of our economy which arguably bore the brunt of the pandemic, small business and small business owners. What are there actions that the legislature can take right now that can directly help small businesses in Kansas, so many of them shuttering, going out of business, and not coming back after the pandemic? Thoughts on this, Representative Xu?
The biggest thing that we can do is get vaccines out as quickly as possible, get coronavirus over as quickly as possible. I think we all know that has been a tremendous challenge for our small businesses because of that reason. I will say that this new bill that just passed out of the federal Congress has a lot of funds appropriated specifically for small businesses. There are certainly things that we can look at the state level, but I have not heard of anything specifically. I think there are certain bills that might serve as a mechanism for small businesses to get funds from the county, but that didn't really make sense for me. But other than that, I don't know if you've heard anything different.
Representative Sanders, what can the legislature do directly? How do we help the small business owners in Kansas?
I think the Schools to Careers program is a big way that we can help to help them get qualified employees. I think that the bill that we passed out of the House just this week that targets, I think it's 10 specific areas of high demand job fields that we're going to give some relief with the funding of education, higher ed or secondary ed, to help fill the need if people will go into these high demand job areas and then stay in the state of Kansas for a period of time.
We've got Randy from Great Bend. He's back on line 1. Maybe to clarify some things. Randy, your question? Good evening.
Yes, I called earlier. I just wondered, I guess my question was kind of directed, the federal government has overreached everything that they were set up by the Constitution to consider. There is a movement nationwide where states have decided to stand up for themselves and take the power back and pass the Convention of States Article 5 Convention. I was just wondering how the gentleman thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, Randy, the best thing to do is reach out to the delegation there in Washington.
But now what he's talking about is Convention of States.
Oh, go ahead.
And so I'm very supportive of the Convention of States movement. There are 2 ways to amend the federal Constitution.
State convention route being one.
And the one that has never, to my knowledge, has never been used.
Not quite. 18th Amendment prohibition.
Is the Convention of States. And yes, I think that it's time that that the state of Kansas get on board with the Convention of States movement, and that is a decision that is made in the local legislatures around the country. And if that comes up, and I know they're pushing it hard, I think they have to get like 37 states on board, and last I knew they were in the 20s somewhere. So I would be very supportive of calling a convention of states.
This is where I get to remind people I'm a boring academic, and as a political historian of the Progressive Era, is the 18th Amendment, prohibition, the only amendment to go the state convention route, and that has a lot to do with local options, the issue of prohibition gathering at a local level and through the state. Representative Xu, thoughts on that?
I would
not
be-
on that, but the
I would be very, very hesitant to support a convention of the states. The truth is once it opens up, we don't know what's going to come out. And I know that some people have an idea of what might, what not. You could go in and come out with the Second Amendment gone. That could be a result. Probably not, but we'll see. And then so I think that to a large extent, and sometimes frustratingly so, government moves slow for a reason. I think convention of states would be a very, very quick burst of a lot of very big changes in this country that I think would lead to a lot of chaos.
so many interesting questions we could ask if this were a show for U.S. representatives, like the filibuster in the Senate, et cetera, but good thoughts. Good thoughts on that. Let's talk about the vaccines. You mentioned vaccinations as a solution for small business owners, or helping small business owners. One of the things that we can do. According to the Kansas Speak survey, Docking Institute, 41% of respondents stated they would get vaccinated. Only 41%. 28% say they would not get vaccinated. 31% said they were not sure. Now, that was published in the fall. I suspect those numbers have changed a little bit, and we've already seen some indication that there's greater acceptance of the COVID-19 vaccine, or the three that are out there and available. How do you, as elected officials, guarantee to the public that these vaccines are safe and that they're necessary? Representative Sanders?
You don't, and that's part of the problem. I mean, while I appreciate the work under President Trump to the warp speed effort to get the vaccines out in record time or whatever, until you have some history and some data with what are the effects 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, and so on. And we simply don't have that data and won't have that data. And so it's an individual choice, and I'm certainly not critical of anybody who chooses to get the vaccine, nor am I critical of anybody who chooses not to. It's an individual choice, and our role in state government is to make the vaccine available to anybody who wants it.
Representative Xu, response to that?
I totally agree. It's an individual choice. I do genuinely believe that we need to do everything we can to get as many people vaccinated as possible, though. So one thing, I got it. I just had my second Moderna dose last week, and I did feel a little bit of fatigue and a little bit of chills, but that's far preferable than getting the COVID. But as a result of me getting that means I get to go home next weekend and finally get my baby to see my parents again for the first time in 6 months. And so the more that we can get life back to normal, the faster we can get these vaccines out, I think the better.
We've got one caller we're going to squeeze in here. Bob from Salina, I believe you're back. Bob on line one. Good evening. What is your question?
Yeah, my question is about the unemployment. My question is about unemployment and unemployment fraud in Kansas. I run a small business, and I've gotten several this year unemployment claims that they never worked for me. The people never did. Don't know who they are. And, of course, I filled them out and I sent them back, because if you don't, the state automatically just sends those people wherever they are, sends them the money. And how many hundreds of millions of dollars it cost our state this year because of the system. And then also, too, like I said, I run a small business, and I've been trying to hire people. I can't get anybody to apply. Why are they giving unemployment money out when there's jobs for people out there? Are they going to do anything about that? And also my unemployment insurance, I haven't had an unemployment claim in 15 years in business, but my rates go up. Can you guys answer those questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That's your constituent there in Salina.
Yes.
We got only a couple of minutes, but quick response.
So you're right. I mean, that's part of the problem with the stimulus payments that are going out. It de-incentivizes people to get back to work. We need to incentivize people to get back to work. But I will say this, anybody who legitimately has unemployment that's due them should get it. And you're also right. I've heard stories about people getting money, things showing up on a 1099 form, that money they never got because their identity has been stolen. And it's a real problem. I don't know what the solutions are, but I do think we need to incentivize people to get back to work, and I do think we need to get rid of the fraud.
Good, good. We're almost out of time here. We've had a great conversation, I think, and it's great to have a show with Republican and Democrat and talk some policy and hash some things out. Thank you so much for coming out here to Western Kansas, and great to see you, Representative Sanders, as well. I'm Dr. Jay Steinmetz, Assistant Professor at Fort Hays State University, and you've been watching the Kansas Legislature. Thank you, and tune in next time for our next episode.